Hi there, BookTube, and welcome to Horror Mayhem, a BookTube event started by the Bryants, Scott and Becky Bryant, over at the Bookish Bryants, to read and talk about horror literature. Ideally, short form horror literature, however, that is not a hard and fast rule. You're welcome to read anything you want, but we are recommending stuff that is about 250 pages or less. That way you can get introduced to horror if you don't really read horror. Plus, in my opinion, you get to then read a bunch of different stuff, especially if you go the really short route of short stories, and you can compare and contrast different methods of writing horror, which can be a lot of fun, and find stuff that you really like. So if you read a bunch of the stories of one particular author or a certain genre, you'll know you like that. And you don't have to take a big risk of reading a big 400, 500 page book. Um, Unfortunately, this year, the Bryants cannot host as they are experiencing a health crisis. My thoughts are with them. I do miss them quite a bit. But the co-hosts are continuing the event with their blessing. And there's a lot of co-hosts. I will link them down below. Uh, I was asked to co-host, and this is my second year hosting an event or co-hosting an event created by the Bryants. I also co-hosted New Worlds November back in 2022. Loved it, absolutely loved it. Made a lot of good friends who I still read with, so I'm very happy about that. I'm not going to talk too much more about the event itself. Instead, I wanted to go ahead and show some stuff I've been reading. Some preliminary stuff, some stuff that I was reading before May began, as well as something I just read 5 minutes ago. uh, and the event is divided into weekly prompts, which I will be mindful towards, and I will, I do intend to read some stuff specifically for those weekly prompts. However, I am not going to only read towards those prompts. For instance, the first week we are reading stuff related to local horror, which your interpretation, what local is to you, it could be your state, your city, your country, whatever. Uh, and I do actually have one story in this stack that is local to me, where the author is local to me. He's from Peoria, Illinois, and I live around Peoria, Illinois. The rest, though, are just stories I read because I wanted to read them, and I will probably do that for most of the month. Is read stuff here and there that fit the prompts, but also just read a bunch of stuff in general. So I'm gonna just jump right in. Uh, and I should note, this is in no real order. I'm just talking about the stories as I picked them up. So, I've got this anthology called The Living Dead, which I got from the library. I've so far read two stories out of this. One of which is the one that I just finished reading, and which does fit the weekly prompt. And that is this year's class photo by Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons was a writer most well known for the Hyperion Cantos. He also wrote The Terror, Drood, Care Comfort, Summer of Night. I've only ever read, before this, The Terror, which I do love. And if you notice, I keep looking to the side, because I've got The Terror right over there. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But once I get through these. This year's class photo is a very good story. It should be noted, all these stories, if it's not obvious, are about zombies. I believe they're about zombies. I'm not sure. I don't think there's any like vampires or anything in here. I'm pretty sure this is entirely zombie-related fiction. But this year's class photo is about a teacher who has been living in the zombie apocalypse for like 27 years or something. A long while. And was teaching even longer before that. And what she calls the tribulations, this, I guess, the period of anarchy directly when the apocalypse had begun, has passed. There is something akin to peace in her life. She is the only human seemingly alive in her area, but she still keeps class because she has she has a bunch of her students and other children who have wandered in, zombified, who she keeps chained in her classroom trying to teach. And that is a disturbing and heartbreaking thing to read about, but it is so very interesting. The teacher learns a bunch of practical skills in order to defend the facility, and she is not insane. That's an interesting way to write it, is that she's not an insane person. She's not just trying to grasp at straws. She's trying to hopefully connect with some kind of humanity these kids might still have, to give some meaning to her life and her existence. The story is really, really good. I don't want to go too much into where it leads and the ending, but there is some truly emotional stuff in here. There's a part where she's talking about how even before the apocalypse, how much she was giving to these kids, how she was trying to save the kids from bullies, from abusive households, from sexual abuse, and being hurt, from a society that wants them to grow up too quickly, from administrators who are too cynical or who are following the latest educational philosophy that could harm their learning experience. And there's a particular part where she comes across the abusive father of one of the kids, a bully himself, and there is some chilling stuff in here, but it has that right blend between disturbing and heartwarming that is really, really, really beautiful. I really do like this story quite a bit, and I do recommend it quite a bit. I also read out of this anthology a few days ago a story called Bitter Grounds, which is a lot harder to explain. That one, by the way, is by Neil Gaiman, writer of American Gods, which I have read and I love. Also, Sandman, which I have read quite a bit of, although I haven't finished it. Coraline, never read it, but I love the movie, and a bunch of other stuff. This one is really hard to explain. And I don't really entirely know what exactly is going on in the story. So it definitely warrants a reread on my part. I also do note that if I do reread it, I probably will not come back to it, as I think it's the kind of story that warrants you going in without too much information. But to give you the initial premise, it follows a man, an unnamed narrator, who meets an anthropologist, and the anthropologist disappears after telling the narrator about a lecture that he's going to go. A lecture, what's the word? A conference, there we go, of different anthropologists delivering lectures, and he's going to deliver a lecture on voodoo zombies. And the narrator decides to deliver it for him after the anthropologist disappears, goes to New Orleans, comes across some potential voodoo zombies and people holding the people in that kind of servitude. But you never really learn why the man's doing this, what it's trying to say about him, and what his past is, even what his name is. So it is a good story, but it's one that I think I will have to reread at least one or two more times to really understand what is going on. But I do recommend it. And then, this is an anthology that I already owned. This is The Tales of Terror and the Unknown by Algernon Blackwood. I have read two stories by Algernon Blackwood before this. Those are The Willows and The Wendigo, which are both very, very good. The Willows especially is, in my opinion, one of the greatest horror stories I've ever read, uh, which I highly, highly recommend. This this writer was a big influence on H.P. Lovecraft, and in my opinion, is a better writer than H.P. Lovecraft. His prose, in particular, I think, is better. The way he writes nature is absolutely beautiful. And I read the second story in this anthology because the first story is The Willows, and that is I think it's the woman's ghost story. Yeah, the woman's ghost story, and it was okay. It's just about a woman telling a story to a group of people, and the story involves her going to a haunted house that was said to be haunted by a young woman and coming across a young man. And the story is not horrific at all. It's not scary, in my opinion. It's really more of a mystical, spiritual story, I'd say. And the central supernatural entity is not written to be threatening, unlike, say, the Willows or the Wendigo, where the thing definitely is threatening. Even if it's threatening in kind of an absurd, out there sort of way, where you don't really know how it's going to do something to you or what it's going to do to you. It's okay, but it's definitely my least favorite that I've read of him so far. I do intend to read more from this anthology. Particularly, I want to read the last story in this anthology called The Camp of the Dog, which I believe is about a werewolf. So, I also read a story out of this, Penny Dreadfuls. This was an anthology that was held up on Gareth's channel over at the Book Songs and Other Magic. And this is just a collection of classic Gothic horror. It should be noted this is not only Penny Dreadfuls. The old Victorian stories that were sold for a penny. Probably the most famous is Varney the Vampire, who there is an excerpt of Varney the Vampire in this book. But that's not all it has. It also has Frankenstein, for instance, in here, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe, I think it's Lost in the Pyramids by Louisa May Alcott, Sweeney Todd, and several others. I read The Adventure of a German Student by Washington Irving, which is the second story in this collection. The first is Frankenstein, which I do not plan to read for this month. I do plan to read it later in the year, probably around November, December, as it feels like a winter book to me. But, it was okay. It's really short, and it basically just involves a German student living in France during the French Revolution, and coming across a young woman at a guillotine, which probably tells you most of what you need to know about the story. It's about, 5 pages long, ends about how you would expect it to end if you've read any stories with that kind of premise. And it's okay. I didn't particularly love it. It's fine. It's probably my least favorite story out of the ones I've read that I'm going to show you here, but it's okay. I did also start to read The Werewolf by what's the guy's name? It is Richard Thompson, The Werewolf: A Legend of the Limousine, which I honestly don't know if I'm going to continue that. I started reading it the other day, and it bored me, honestly. So I might come back to it, I might not. There's a lot of other stuff in this anthology that I do actively really want to read, like Varney. I want to reread The Pendulum. I'd like to read The Sweeney Todd, the one about the mummy that I mentioned, several others. So I may come back to that, I might not. I've got here The Weird. This is a collection of weird fiction. Edited by Jeff and Anne Vandermeer. Jeff Vandermeer is most well known for, I would say, his Southern Reach trilogy. That is Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. I've read the first two of those, and I enjoy them. And out of this, I read the Clive Barker story, in the hills, the cities, which is probably one of the best things I've read out of this stack. It's a really good story. It's not giving too much away. It's about two young men, newlyweds, who are traveling through Eastern Europe, around about Serbia, Kosovo, I think, also, and going to a bunch of famous landmarks, churches. One of them is very political and cynical. The other one is more of a hopeless romantic artsy type. And they fight a lot and then fuck a lot. um, and they come across something strange and horrifying. Horrifying for them, the story itself is really not that scary, but it is disturbing. And the story deals, I think, with how individual people are kind of pulled together into community and the dangers of that and what happens when different communities go to conflict. And I'll leave it at that. I will say that there is body horror in this, so if you don't like body horror, you might not want to read this. But it is good, and it's a very, it's disturbing, it's kind of creepy, it's awesome in the sense of it actually inducing awe. Really good, though. The last two stories I want to show are out of this. This is the new Cthulhu, the recent Weird by, it's edited by Paula Garan, sorry. And I've read two stories out of this. I read a Neil Gaiman story, which is called Study in Emerald, which is a pastiche of Lovecraftian horror, as well as a pastiche of Sherlock Holmes. And it follows a detective and his friend trying to solve a murder. A murder that was done to the nephew of the Queen. But the problem is the nephew and the Queen are not human. In fact, they are the old ones, who, like 800 years earlier, conquered humanity and are now the controllers of the world. They are the royal lineages. And it references several of these rulers. A mortal pharaoh over in Egypt, and a black goat of the woods with many young over in, I think, France. It doesn't use those names specifically, but it's obviously referencing entities like Nyarlathotep and Shep-Niggurath and so on and so forth. And it's really good. It does have some interesting twists to it. I do enjoy it, though. The other story I read out of this was the second story. I skipped the first as of now, because the first is Pickman's Other Model by Caitlin R. Kiernan, and I have not read Pickman's Model, which is an H.P. Lovecraft story that this is obviously a sequel to, so I want to read that first before I read Pickman's Other Model. What I did read was Fair Exchange by Michael Marshall Smith, and I really like this story also. It's a burglar burgles a house, and he gets a pearl. A really beautiful pearl, and a bunch of jewelry also. The jewelry is sold, but he holds on to the pearl. And then the jewelry ends up being far, far more valuable than he originally thought. One of the things that struck me about this story is just how unlikable the narrator is. He is such a prick. He's really, really unlikable. There's a part where he talks about a past conversation with some other man, and the man basically asks him how he can do it, how he can burgle people's houses, and says, if your mom was burgled like this, you would be angry, and gets into a whole conversation about how to the burglar, none of the stuff he takes is that important, but to the people that might be the stuff he's taking might have deep emotional meaning to them, but he just doesn't care because to them, because to him they're just cattle. So you feel like you're reading the thoughts of a sociopath. Again, it is really good. But that's all the stuff that I've read recently for Horror Mayhem. I'm going to read a lot more today because I am off. So I'm going to plan to read from all these anthologies and more throughout the next couple days, throughout the next months. I also do have 2 other things I want to show you that I have not yet read, but I will shortly. First of all, I've got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I am reading with Brandy over at the Book Collectic, and with Sean D. Standfast. I've also got The Terror, which I am rereading with Sean D. Standfast and a bunch of other booktubers. So that's everything I have to show you today, and someone's making a bunch of noise outside, so I'm gonna end that here. Anyways, bye, BookTube.